Welcome to Socialism 101, the Communist Manifesto. This book, or pamphlet, if you will, was written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and was a way of inciting particular action in response to the conditions of the time. We're going to talk a lot more about the historical context of the Communist Manifesto and more why it was written at that particular time in our next education session, talking about the Paris Commune, in particular talking about why the manifesto was written to inspire revolution in France in the 1800s. However, we want to go step back a little bit and talk more about the fundamental principles described in the manifesto. And I'm going to be broadly making an argument for why reading the manifesto is a good thing to learn about our modern or contemporary situation. Now, the easiest way to follow along with this talk is probably to download the document that I posted in the library section. So if you go, for example, into the YDSA Discord and then go to the library channel, it'll have a thing called handout for the manifesto discussion. Feel free to download that. That has basically everything we're possibly going to go over today and some extra things that we may not cover. So you might want to check back at that at the end just to make sure you're keeping up with all the information. So I'm going to let people have a second to download that if they'd like. Okay. While you're pulling that up, getting it open, I wanted to introduce the manifesto in a different way, which is many of you probably picked up the book, saw that there was lots of different language in there that is definitely much older than the kind of language we would use today. There's also probably some surprising language that sounds more like familiar to what we would use today than what you might have expected as well. So first I wanted to start with a question of like, how was the reading? Like temperature, I'm going to ask everyone in the room, everyone has to give an answer. Like, was it easy for you? Are you familiar with the book? Just tell me, like, what did the reading feel like going through the Communist Manifesto? And if you didn't get a chance to read it or couldn't make it through the whole thing, let me know. Now is a good time so that I can make sure that I hit all the right points and make sure everyone feels like they're participating. So we'll start with Mikey.
I listened to the book, and I really liked it. I told you, Daniel, I was like, look, they're addressing like every single anti-communist argument, every single anti-communist argument you've ever heard. They were all around in 1848. They haven't invented any new arguments. So I thought that was really engaging because I was like thinking of like how what they're saying applies to things that people talk about in politics like now. And I've read a lot of historical stuff, so I'm not fazed by the like little like older language.
Fair enough. Sarah.
Unlike Mikey, I was a little phased by the big words, if you will. I also did listen to it, but I like read along with the transcript as well, so just to like try and digest it a little more. I felt like after listening, like I didn't have any like big epiphanies or anything. I felt like they were like, I don't know. Yeah. I mean, it was like definitely a good read. But I don't know if reading it before and after changes like my views on socialism that much because I don't know, yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah,
Toby.
it's so like matter of
Oh,
fact.
sorry.
Just like it's so
Yeah.
matter of fact that it's just
Yeah.
like, yeah, that's just how it is. The first time I read it, that's literally how I was like, I read the whole thing. I was like, I agree with this completely, put it down, completely forgot everything that was in it.
That's funny. That's funny. Toby, how was the reading for you?
I would say the word choice or the verb, like what they chose to write in, wasn't too terrible. I'm pretty familiar with that, but the beginning of section 2 and the end of section 3, where they're just like, oh, let me rapid fire definitions at you, and then also here's all the different types of socialism and what they all stood for without a whole lot of analysis. It was like, oh, this is a lot to process. I also listened to the book, so maybe I should have read it so that I could take notes, but I don't have a physical copy, and I prefer that. So that was a lot. But like Mikey said, like I was already familiar with a lot of the counter arguments, which I thought was good. Like not only do you argue your case, but you preemptively argue against people who are like, oh, well, that's not right because of this, 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 and this. And like, you know what's coming. And like Mikey said, like the arguments haven't changed because these are all things that I've already encountered as someone who's not very literate in terms of politics, socialism versus capitalism versus communism. Like there's versus everything else. So the fact that I'd already seen these, like, yeah, Mikey's so right that they haven't come up with anything new.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay. Then Sam and Gabe. Sam, you go first.
I thought it was a little easier reading it in English than it was the original German. But
Okay, yeah.
I found that a little bit easier, but no, it's generally speaking, if you understand the context of what comes after it, what the context of the times, then it's not necessarily as hard to read. Fortunately, I was able to know the context that comes after in the times of such, so hearing about, the evolution from feudalism to capitalism and the bourgeois and the specter that's haunting Europe, etc. It wasn't necessarily as hard. He makes it pretty simplistic, and again, this is also at a time when he was writing to, uh, working class proletariats working in a factory who probably weren't as literate as, say, um, six college educating or educated students. So he makes it pretty
Yeah.
easy.
And Gabe.
So I'll follow the trend of everyone else listening to the audio. So that's what I did as well. And then although I have actually read it like the book form like several years ago, and so that's like, oh, I'll try the audio version for a try. I found it actually fairly conversational. I didn't have any problems with the language, but that's probably because like a lot of the terms we have come across before in my degree, because a lot of like planning literature is actually some of it's written by like what we call like neo-Marxists and stuff like that in planning. And so some of the terms, but like the idea of commodification and stuff like that, property and things like that is like, oh, well, that comes up in my, planning classes. Um, I was also interested in listening to like the historical elements, and kind of doing I was able to compare and contrast about what's currently going on and what happened in the past. It seemed like a lot of stuff that was being said was like, oh, that's still currently going on in today's society. I can still see a lot of similarities. And then other times when he's referencing, revolutions and like the ongoing revolutions in other countries, it's like, oh, I remember hearing about that in history textbooks, but
Yeah.
that's not current. Like we're not seeing like the Paris Commune revolution going on right now. That's like some of this stuff has changed considerably. And so I'm also interested in learning about what, what changes like we can, I'm trying to think of how to phrase it, but
Yeah, we'll talk about some of the
Okay.
differences, the like
Yeah.
contemporary versus historical differences and things. Will, did you get a chance to read the manifesto? And if so, how was the reading?
I've I got to about finishing 2/3 of it. I'd say that I think of what I've read, it's yeah, it's very interesting. I think trying to recall bits of it. I think the manifesto mentioned how this, a sort of transition from. I think it said that part of the nobility detached itself. Detached itself from the to join the emergent bourgeois, and then the bourgeois part of the bourgeois was going to detach itself to integrate into the proletariat. And I think it also mentioned how the progress of how the progressive industry would like proletarianize more and more people. Yeah. So very interesting stuff, and yeah, I look forward to hearing you guys discuss about it, even if I haven't finished it, which I'll do
Awesome.
tomorrow.
Yeah, and by all means, take your time. I hope that this can elucidate some of the things, especially I heard some thoughts about like, well, there's some historical things that people are missing. There's also some contextual or like theoretical things that people are missing. I'm hoping that this can cover the breadth of those issues. The primary focus of this talk is going to be on sections 1 and 2. We will be talking a decent bit about section 3, but section 4, I'm going to largely leave for the Paris Commune discussion, because it is, as you may remember, a large dump, if you read that section, on just like, here's a bunch of parties that exist at this time and we hate them. Like it's a pretty it's a pretty adversarial take there at the end, and it needs its own different attention. Okay, with that, I wanted to introduce our reading here with some of the following. So let me share my screen and hopefully my computer sound as well. Awesome. So you don't have to see what's in the clip because he's just talking, but we're going to play why you should read the Communist Manifesto. I wonder why we're hearing it right now, but he talks about what exactly the manifesto is, and it's kind of like some of its relevancy.
You have to, when you read the manifesto, read it as a historical document. Communists, socialists, or Marxists do not read the manifesto the way, say, Christians read the Bible or Muslims read the Quran. Don't look at these documents as the word, like somehow Marx is a substitute God and he has spoken. And so in order to get knowledge, you must embrace and accept the word. And if possible, repeat the word. Repeat it over and over again, like in a liturgical style. That's not the way to read the manifesto. The way to read the manifesto is to read it as a historical document, not as a religious text. And you have to understand, what is Marx, or what are Marx and Engels doing when they write this pamphlet? What are they fighting about? What are they trying to convince people of? They're in the middle of an argument with the other people who are emerging as socialists during this period of revolution, that there has to be a way to look at society differently from the way the utopian socialists looked at society. The utopian.
So he's going to talk about some stuff we'll get to later, but essentially, yes, we should be thinking about this as a historical document, but that many of the principles may remain. One other thing that's important to reconcile with is when we get to section 2, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the history, but I said we'll get to a lot more of that history when we do the thing next week. I also wanted to bring up this book review that I found online that I think is pretty funny, but is also kind of exemplary of like why we're reading the manifesto in particular, because as you have rightly pointed out, much of the arguments against communism or socialism or Marxist thought has not really changed since 1848. Just here, listen to this clip.
The Communist Manifesto is not primarily a description of what the principles of communism can create for the working class, how it can make them a wonderful utopia in the world, but primarily communism is about what it will destroy and how that destruction will unite the working class together. The exception of Marx is the bourgeois class. Now, I needed to do a little bit of digging to discover who these nefarious people were who created every ill in society. And it's tough to make an even parallel with the bourgeois and what we have in the American economy today. I think they could best be described as some type of upper middle class in the 19th century. Today,
boom, so good. This guy is amazing. Not really. Not really. Essentially, he goes on to say that the Communist Manifesto is essentially a very angry document, and that Marx is just an angry old little man, and that he needs to sit down. Quite literally, you can watch the next 4 minutes and find out for yourself. It is quite amusing. But there's a reason I wanted to share some of that, because I think that the writers of some of the newer versions of the manifesto, or edited versions or annotated versions that I delved into when trying to prepare this talk, make it very clear why the manifesto is so useful for checking back against rhetoric like that, where he literally at the same time is explaining some of the good things about the manifesto while trying to couch them in negative language in ways that either clearly misrepresent what the manifesto is saying or literally just demonstrate why the manifesto is a good thing. So here's Phil Gasper on the subject. The Communist Manifesto was first published in February 1848. Why is it still worth reading a book that was written so long ago? One answer is that Marx and Engels describe a world that is still recognizably our own. Much has changed since the mid-19th century, but like Marx and Engels, we still live in a capitalist society. Precisely because Marx and Engels lived at a time when modern capitalism was young, they were able to analyze the system in a way that still seems, to many, to capture its essential features and its core dynamic. Marx and Engels praise the way in which capitalism has shattered narrow horizons and produced technological marvels, but they also see a capitalism as a system that is increasingly running out of control. A system that concentrates wealth and power in the hands of a small minority, creates huge pools of poverty, turns life into a daily grind that prevents most people from fulfilling their potential, and experiences frequent and enormously wasteful economic crises. Capitalist development is also highly destructive of the natural environment, and economic competition between capitalist states often leads to military confrontation and war. The only solution to these potentially devastating problems, according to the manifesto, is the abolition of capitalism itself and its replacement by a system in which the majority of the population democratically controls society's economic resources. In other words, genuine communism. Marx and Engels' proposal is, to say the least, controversial. If the roots of these problems run as deeply as Marx and Engels contend, then radical action remains necessary. That, perhaps, is reason enough to ponder the alternative they advocate. Now, I want to contextualize that because this could just be made as an argument of, I don't know, there's some stuff that we see today that's like kind of similar to the manifesto, therefore it's useful to study. No, we need to take it one step further and think about that question about specifically, if those problems run as deeply as Marx and Engels contend, then radical action remains necessary. Perhaps that is reason enough to ponder the alternative they advocate. I think this preface from A Spectre Haunting by Sheena Maville is really particularly good on this question about the problems running as deeply as Marx and Engels contend. So here it is. Morgenthau's father, a doctor working in a working class neighborhood, begun to take his son along on house calls. Patients were dying of tuberculosis. A doctor couldn't do much, but might be able to help them die with dignity. Many people asked to have the Bible buried with them. But Morgenthau's father asked his workers for last requests. Many said they wanted to be buried with the manifesto instead. To hear of such yearning at the end of a hard life and to see it in a mere fallacy, mere foolishness, is a breathtaking, empathetic, and epistemological miserliness. Miserliness thinking of Scrooge in the Christmas Carol. No one should not celebrate all books. No, one should not celebrate all books with which a person might beg to be buried with, simply because of the request. But the plea was for this book, that cleaves unremittingly to liberation, that burns with fury at injustice. So bright, it represents to those wanting a dignity in death denied to them in life a presence so strong that it brought them comfort to bring it with them across that ultimate divide. The manifesto was built atop a catechism, a confession of communist faith. Critics of Marx are keen to zero in on his 1843 description of religion as the opium of the masses, but far less to acknowledge his reading of the same phenomenon as the sigh of the oppressed, the heart of a heartless world, the soul of soulless conditions, or religious suffering as the expression of real suffering and also a protest against it. Protest against the suffering of class society is predicated for the manifesto's authors on an intuition that the world need not be so, an intuition that is correct. I hope those kind of shed some light on why the manifesto is not just a document that happens to be a text in history, but rather is a particularly important document, not only for our uses, but for society writ large. It has inspired movements, not just in 1800s France, but also across the world who have bought and read and shared this book as a way to demonstrate the reasons why the world is so messed up as it is, but also the idea that we can actually change it. That very revolutionary idea that we can take the world and the suffering that we are in and transform it into something new. So, as Meville points out, it is not just that it is suffering itself that is there, and it is not that we are praising this as the Bible, so to speak, from that YouTube clip that we watched, but rather that the manifesto is an expression of the very sigh of the oppressed and what we can actually do against it. The intuition that the world need not be the suffering of class society, an intuition that is correct. So let's go to section 1, the bourgeois and the proletarians. The first segment we're going to cover is historical materialism. So in the very first sentence of this chapter is, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. The next paragraph goes, freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, this might actually be a couple paragraphs down, but freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guild master and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on in uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight. A fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large, or in the common ruin of the contending classes. Now, after reading all of this, how does the manifesto describe current class society? And I'd like anyone who's willing to unmute and answer, feel free to answer it. You don't have to be like super accurate with it. I'm just looking for a basic couple of sentences. How would the manifesto describe current class society?
It's like in our nature to be fighting each other. Like each class is always going to be pitted against the other classes in some way, and there is no escaping that.
Yeah, that's one important point, that the classes are necessarily conflictual, that there are two groups of people at least, and that each of them has very different interests, and those interests are necessarily in conflict.
Sounds almost dialectical.
Yes, yes. So this, you can even see it in the words and the kind of like structure of this paragraph, right? Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guild master and journeyman, right? It's always this relationship between the oppressor and the oppressed, right? How they are always at the same time in opposition, but creating in their opposition the society writ large, which means that the interests, the clashing interests of the both of them, produces the society over and over again. Much of this is tied to the like philosophical idea of Hegelian dialectics, where you have the idea of the the thesis, the antithesis, so the thing opposite the thesis, and then synthesis, because when you have thesis and its opposite, right, the combination of those two, as in their interaction, is what produces synthesis and allows you to understand the result. This is the same way how like try to describe hot without describing cold. How do you know something is hot? Try to take cold out of your mind. You can't explain how something is hot other than it burns maybe, but why does it burn? Well, it's no longer cold. It's certainly not lukewarm or anything else. It's certainly way hotter than you are, which you would then be cold. That's a very simplistic example, but it's one that's helpful. One other essential portion is going to be elucidated by this question, which is, do you think that for at least the majority of our history, or at least a large part of the history that we have been taught or remember, that we have been living in what Marx would call class society? Yeah. Sarah, you want to talk about it? Why? Why are we living in class society?
Not to sound like the smartass, but just because there are still very distinct classes. Like there's still very much a ruling class and a working class today, and there always has been. Well, at least since this man wrote it, you know.
Yes. So that's exactly what Marx is getting at. He says that by yeah, Mikey.
Yeah, anthropologist, and I assume this is like partially Marxist, but would say that like the very earliest societies, like prehistory societies, are like could be like are like yes, there were like classes, but there weren't like Yeah, I'm trying to remember what.
Yeah, I understand what you're
Okay.
getting at, Mikey. We'll actually talk about that in the future. We'll read Engels's, I think it's the origin of the state, property, and family, or some ordering of those three phrases, and it explicates the arguments at the time from anthropology about how like pre-class societies worked and existed. But I want to focus particularly on this term historical materialism. So, what do we think materialism means? What does materialism mean? Somebody who hasn't answered the question yet.
I think a centrality of material. It's literally material things. It's literally materialism. I think maybe in the pop consciousness, materialism is like being obsessed with wealth or basically material things. I know that you also have. Okay, maybe this is irrelevant, but you also, I think, maybe in philosophy, you also have like metaphysical materialism that concern that basically says only matter exists. But I think probably the relevant idea to this discussion is basically just a focus on the influence of material conditions and yada yada.
Yes. So the literal stuff that is around us that orchestrates our economies, our realities, the world that we live in, the stuff that constructs all of that. Excuse me for a moment. Okay.
The stuff that constructs all of that is in particular.
Okay. That should be fine. The literal stuff that constructs our societies, the way we live and the way we experience the world is what determines our philosophies or our societies. There was a previous concurrent of philosophy that was called idealism, which said that you could, by changing the ideas of people, say, for example, convincing someone that something is, some idea is true or not, that you could then shift the course of society by continuing to convince more and more people of these things. Marx says, flip that on its head. It is really hard to convince someone who is poor and, say, working under their boss's toil, right? And forced to work under wage labor. Hard to convince them that they are actually living in a paradise. You cannot change the material world that they are living in or their experience without physically maneuvering the stuff that is around them. It is impossible for us to restructure our politics, societies, and economies just on ideas alone or trading different notions with one another. Rather, we have to instead physically reorient the economy or the stuff around us. Now, what is the key thing about historical materialism? Sam, you want to take this? So why do we have historical materialism as opposed to just materialism?
Yeah, so historically materialism, right? So we start to notice in history what wars happen, why necessarily the conflict between class happens, right? So why does this happen? Well, there's materialism. Materialism is this idea that, the resources that we have and where they go, this and that, will often, I guess, bring us a higher status, right? So historically, you'll always have the growth from primitivism to Roman, like, economics. I don't know what Roman economics would be. It's not
Slave
feudalism, is
society.
it? Yeah,
Slave
slave society, feudalism, so then capitalism, right? And as it goes, materialism follows with it. There's materials that you need for everything. So I believe Stalin wrote something pretty well on that. I'll have to look back on the notes for that. But
Sure.
yeah, so it's just the growth and development of basically materialism as it goes historically and the analysis of it.
And the real key is like that Marx, when he was developing these theories about socialism in particular, he was looking at the others in his day talking about like whatever their ideal socialism was often making some kind of like perfect commune that would fail in 3 years because they didn't actually try to understand the situations of the people around them. Or we're just like, if we just all believe and agree to do the same shit together, then we'll be fine. And that was very much incorrect. But he goes and looks at history and says, okay, how do societies grow grow and develop and change over time, and tried to figure out what is the common undercurrent that demonstrates something we can now predict for the future. And so the real important part about historical materialism is that it is saying, yes, stuff is what structures how society functions in any given time in history. Then, if you change the stuff, you change how societies form, and now you have a new society. So how do we trace the difference or the transition between one society and the next? How do we have a theory for understanding what we should do to get from one society to the next? And what are our responses to the current society that we are in? How can we respond to those things? So that's all coming from a tradition of historical materialism. We'll dive a lot more deeply into this in future lectures, but I think it's just good to understand that as you read that first chapter, you're hearing a lot about here's what happened in the past, here's what the bourgeois did in the past, here's what feudal society did in the past, and here's how we got to today. Because it's important that we analyze our historical and contemporary situations to understand those developments so that we can move forward with those knowledges. With regard to the historical part of historical materialism, not abandoning materialism here at all, we're going to talk about the transition to capitalism, because I think that's the other strength of this section, that while it is almost a little bit light as well, talking about the feudal system, and that there are plenty of critiques these days about the way that Marx identified the transition between feudal systems and capitalism, or even from previous systems like slave society to feudalism, it is certainly true, at the very least, that we know that society is not predominantly a feudal system anymore. Instead, we are in a global capitalist system. So, what was the cause of the transition between the feudal system to capitalism? Does anyone have an idea about that? And it doesn't have to be exactly from the reading either. If you're just like, this is what I think, then that's totally fine too.
Industrialization for the most part.
Industrialization could be part of it, yeah.
There was also, what was it, Adam Smith? Yeah.
Colonialism, yep.
Yeah.
But Adam Smith's through Wealth of the Nation, that was also a big thing. It was the evolution from feudalism. I would say, damn, I don't want to say the American Revolution was one of the things that kicked off capitalism, but
Well, I mean, that's kind of colonialism.
it's a pretty big part of it.
Yeah, well, I mean,
yeah.
even the American Revolution in particular was like, that was the bourgeois class society at the time saying that feudalism was not working for them because they were not getting enough of the share of their own wealth, right? And so they were like, we need to redefine society in the new Americas, as they were, murdering Native Americans to accumulate their wealth and transforming society into their own image of what would put them into power. We can talk about accumulation in a moment, but I think we all hit on some of the major points. Here's the quotes from the manifesto that I really liked. The feudal system of industry, under which industrial production was monopolized by closed guilds, now no longer sufficed for the growing wants of the new markets, referring to the colonized markets as well as the expansion of territory. The manufacturing system took its place, industrialization. The guild masters were pushed on one side by the manufacturing middle class. Division of labor between the different corporate guilds vanished in the face of new division of labor in a single workshop. This is key, because now we're not talking about lords having ownership, or at least a particularly exploitative relationship over a set of serfs that worked on land that was not theirs. Instead, now we're talking about the new capitalist owner owning the factory in which all the workers work for a wage. And these pressures come out of, in particular, the growing set of industrialization, which meant that guild workers, such as the petty bourgeois, those who are skilled enough to make extra funds on top of their regular farm labor, but also too proximate to, for example, the feudal serfs, to be able to be their own independent ruling class. So think about this. In the UK, it's not like some, basket weaver was going to be able to overthrow the king. That's not going to happen. But what they did do is, with the other parts of the mercantile class, get together, utilize their power as creating new markets that they were selling to other feudal serfs in, and then now go, wait a second, there's all these new resources elsewhere, and the government, as in the king, is now interested in accumulating those resources. What if there's a way we can like kind of take in between that exchange, right? What's a way that we can address that sort of middleman situation? And so they were like, well, win-win. We go set up new society elsewhere where now the problems of living under feudalism are somewhat resolved, and we get to develop society in our own image afterward. Sounds like a great deal. And that's exactly what happens. We see, therefore, how the modern bourgeoisie itself is a product of the long course of development of a series of revolutions in the modes of production and of exchange. Note this, Marx and Engels say a series of revolutions. Not that feudalism and capitalism like transition overnight. There's not a clear defined line of here's the year, date, hour, and minute in which feudalism transitioned to capitalism. We just kind of now live in capitalism. And feudalism becomes unrecognizable to us within the society because the base of our economics has now completely transitioned. Okay, what do they mean by the following quote? The bourgeoisie historically has played a most revolutionary part. Hint, it is related to the statement I just made. So once again, what do they mean by the bourgeoisie historically has played a most revolutionary part? I would encourage Toby or Gabe to answer this.
My interpretation for that was that historically, especially during feudalism, you almost had just a two-class system almost, where you had the royalty or the religious elements, the upper crust, and then you just had the serfs living on the land that was owned by either the church or the feudal lords. And then over time, this progressed, like you said before, where the bourgeoisie was actually created from the guild masters and things like that. And so this new class that emerged, they themselves eventually wanted to have more power and more say and more control. And so they started their own, so-called revolution where they took on more power. And in that regard too, did become more democratic because these people weren't people ordained from another source or another entity. These were quote unquote, common regular people. They weren't ordained by God to, have control over people. And so it became more democratic and put more control in everyday people, like the owners, the guild masters, like you said before. So
that is a great answer. The only texture I want to add to it is in particular, similar to how the bourgeoisie is part of a long course of development, a series of revolutions produces this new mode of exchange. Similarly, this quote from the manifesto kind of answers this. It says, the bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. This means that the bourgeoisie are revolutionary in the sense that they keep having to revolutionize the structure of society in order to maintain their position. So Gabe is very much right, as like the mercantile class is moving over to the Americas or colonizing other places or even developing their stake within markets locally in towns and cities in England or France or wherever, right? They are developing their own sort of class niche, but eventually their interests become contradictory to the lords or the king. So they have to either leave, go elsewhere to kind of resolve that contradiction, or they have to revolutionize their society, their politics, or whatever else is around them in order to fit not just what they want, but what they are doing with the existing society. Similarly, we can look at right now, where we are looking at a world that is largely already divided. where the lines have been drawn as far as we see country borders or things like that. There are international bodies that govern the broad borders that any given country has and the amount of resources that it could possibly have. But there are no limitations on any resources. There's no governing body for capitalism. There's a governing body for politics, for society writ large, but these are mere facades, if you will, for the way that society will continue, and particularly bourgeois society will continue to revolutionize itself to maintain its existence. A big example of this is imperialism. The same way the mercantile class had to leave most of Europe in order to resolve the contradiction of them living under feudalism while also trying to practice capitalism. In the same context, the United States will take the contradiction of the fact that they are pushing too much immiseration on the people domestically to be able to sustain the capitalism that exists here. They instead displace that misery onto the global south in order to grab those resources and continue to accumulate resources and maintain the bourgeois class in power. I.e., the contradiction cannot be resolved until that internal frustration that exists within the bourgeoisie is resolved by displacing it on some other thing. It's expanding and revolutionizing the ability to continue to take, and collect for its own power, wealth, and status. Now, we've talked a lot about the bourgeoisie. What exactly are they? There are two classes as far as Marx and Engels describe. There's the bourgeois class and there's the proletariat class. The bourgeois class makes up the owners of the means of production. These are the people who own the literal stuff that's necessary to continue to reproduce society. Now that can be a lot, but they mean that the bourgeois class not only has the ability to produce ideology that continues to reproduce the idea that the bourgeois are like a good thing and that we should maintain the class systems that we have right now, but also the literal facts of production, the literal forces of production that maintain these class divisions. So for example, it is that every time you wake up and go to work and take a wage and then go buy a car on a loan and then get indebted to a society of banking and strategic money movement to prevent you from accessing real wealth and like social and political power is the everyday reproduction of the bourgeois class, because it is your lack of membership in that class that reproduces that relation. Now, what does it mean for the bourgeoisie to create a world after its own image? Maybe some of y'all can answer that based on some of the hints that I've already provided, but feel free to provide a more comprehensive one. I think, Toby, you seem like you got an answer? Yeah.
I would say, and maybe this is totally off because my brain is kind of full right now, but creating a world after its own image and expanding into other countries and forcing this capitalist idea of more is better on other countries as well, like forcing other countries to adopt the same set of laws, the same expectations of their economies. So they're trying to make all of the countries look the same as themselves, while also at the same time trying to profit off of them. So it's like, oh, we are expanding our own ideas, but also you actually can't be like us because we're actually gonna take from you. So I think I just went on a tangent there.
No, that's beautiful. That was absolutely perfect. We could talk about things for days, like, for example, the IMF or the UN, or the way that various international organizations work within bourgeois interests to say things like that the way the US Constitution is exported abroad, or that the way democracy is supposed to be structured is only within the context of like the American experiment, and that, as so successful as it is, of course, that this experiment needs to be replicated in every corner of the earth, and that if it is not, then it is justification for us to invade those countries, to take their resources, and to hold them in subjugation until they capitulate to bourgeois society. You could look at the good examples of how like there are resistances to that, not notably Cuba, or the unity of the Sahel. If you've not researched the Sahel in Africa right now, you should definitely be paying attention to the resistance work that's being done in Burkina Faso and Niger and others who are now trying to resist like this kind of neo-colonialism and imperialism broadly. But yeah, creating it after its own image is the way the bourgeoisie reproduces itself. Because here's the thing, you cannot have a society without doing the thing and then making the thing happen over and over again. Because we all die, right? And then there's like a bunch of other people born. So like, why don't those ideas also die with those people, right? If there's so many people in so much misery, why is it that the bourgeois class doesn't just literally die out? The answer is because they continue to reproduce their own existence and make the world in their own image. Okay. Now, we're about to talk about the proletariat, but I think this quote is probably one of the most important. Gabe, yes, before we move on, what you got?
I was just going to point out, and I could be incorrect, but I think particularly here in the U.S., the bourgeoisie tries to blur the lines as much as possible between classes. And I know, like, if you talk to, like, there's the quote of like, oh, everyone's a future millionaire. And that's how they kind of go about their lives. It's like, oh, I'm not a poor person. I'm good because I'm a future millionaire. And so you see that, and they've also tried to not, instead of trying to make everyone the proletariat and put the proletariat in charge, they tried to make everyone into bourgeoisie by now everything's focused on home ownership instead of renting. So instead of getting rid of land ownership in general, they promote land ownership and trying to make it available for everyone. And like everyone can invest in the stock market, and now that everyone has the Roth IRAs and 401ks, and that's your retirement fund. But instead of overhauling the system, now everyone, even the poorest people, now subsequently have to get involved in the whole scheme to just, kind of survive. So
I do agree. I want to add some contextualization to that, because I think that the identification that the bourgeois is like opening up these markets for us to like actually participate in them is I don't know that that's what you were trying to imply, but I think that it is that they want the illusion that we can open up and add to these markets, because we know that like real estate is being larger and larger bought up by venture and investment capital. We know that it is near impossible to buy homes. It's near impossible to find jobs and things like that. Like the literal things that we need in order to survive or continue, or even for them to make profit, right? Wages are continuing to go down, which means we don't have the ability to buy actual products. All of these things are part and parcel of the illusion of that American dream, which gets repurposed to where, oh, well, if you don't have a white picket fence and 2.5 kids and a house and all of that stuff and like 3 cars, that's your fault, as opposed to the fault of the system itself. So, just wanted to add the clarity, but I think broadly you're right about the reproduction of those like false ideas.
I also want to add.
Yeah, Mikey.
And this is something that I've done a little bit of reading on. It kind of clicked with that bit about the bourgeoisie, but that in Marx's time, basically before the like latter half of the 1800s, if you were like poor, you were just like trash, you weren't gonna be saved by God. You were like not, the priest just like were like didn't care about you. All these kind of like moral things were kind of put onto you. And in the latter half of the 1800s, there's all these like moral reform campaigns that are trying to make poor children more like middle class children. And it's kind of how we get the idea of the child as like innocent and pure. Like before that obviously they're like doing child labor and shit, which Marx is bastedly against. Sure. But so that's one of the ways of the cultural idea that like that you as a poor person can be more like the bourgeoisie if you conform to these cultural ideas about Christianity and childhood and all these things. Obviously it doesn't work because poor people fail at upholding the bourgeoisie standard of, for example, childhood, because like they're poor. But that's one of the ways that the bourgeoisie puts the
in particular, that's often like that particular class, like identifying with the middle class is identifying with the petty bourgeois. That's what Marx and Engels talk about, the petty bourgeois. These are the people who are like, I own my own small business. Like, hey, you can't say capitalism is bad because I'll lose my business, right? Or I will lose my investment in the forces of production where I've got my 10 employees and I'm, paying them a wage, but I still own literally all of their surplus value and get to exploit them accordingly. And those kinds of things. Like, this is how the petty bourgeois serves as a method for the proletariat to look at these members of bourgeois society who kind of like float between proletariat and bourgeoisie, depending on their like social position at the time, and like their economic status. And for example, they lose their business, great. What do they become? A worker, right? If they maintain their business and get successful, they become a member of the like a higher member of the bourgeoisie, right? And they participate in that stratification. But they also participate in that illusion that you can pull yourself up literally by your bootstraps and become that ultimate bourgeois notion of the like real capitalist, like the self-made man, the small business owner, the successful immigrant, for example, the model minority. Those are all ideas that are developed by bourgeois society to like kind of force us to identify ourselves with bourgeois society and then be like wrong if we don't identify with that. Okay. The last thing I wanted to address with the bourgeois society in particular, and I think this is really important, is that the bourgeoisie itself, therefore, supplies the proletariat with its own elements of political and general education. In other words, it furnishes the proletariat with weapons for fighting the bourgeoisie. Why would the bourgeoisie develop the weapons against itself? Who's got an answer for that? I think the key hint, if you do want to answer, is that this developing the weapons is not intentional.
I'll answer. Basically, how I think it is that the weapons are like education. I mean, like there are like products of industry. They are industry, but also I think education is a big. Would be my example, is that the bourgeoisie needs people to work their like middle management, so they need people to be able to read and write. Once you're able to read and write, you can read the Communist Manifesto, and and then you can like get a deeper understanding of your status in the world. You can go and read about history, or your the bourgeoisie will be like, we need people to be educated to work in our to do a lot of jobs and to like advance our productivity and to like work for us and innovate for us. But that same innovation can be turned like against them.
Yes, so that is one facet of it where it's oh gosh, what was I going to describe it as? It's in part concession and in part revolutionizing the facets of production. So yes, if you have a really highly skilled workforce, for example, it is beneficial for the forces of production to have a really highly skilled workforce who can make a lot of profit off of doing things like AI development. Like AI software development stuff is really, really profitable for the bourgeois class right now. And so them producing a lot of highly educated technical workers are good for that effort. But potentially that can create the conditions where they become conscious of their own situation. However, I think the key here is the more important part than just furnishing the tools of production is in particular that the immiseration of the working class is what makes it so revolutionary in understanding its own situation. Right? That's why I feel very comfortable talking about the bourgeoisie for so long, because I was planning on spending more time in the proletariat, but the dialectical nature of the bourgeois and the proletariat means that every moment that the bourgeois oppresses the proletariat is another reason the proletariat finds to overthrow bourgeois hegemony. And I'll say that again. Every moment the bourgeois oppresses the proletariat is another moment the proletariat realizes the need for overthrowing the bourgeois hegemony. This is why the bourgeoisie itself creates elements of political and general education. Because I can tell you right now, like, drug dealers in the streets of Harlem know damn well how capitalism works. They know damn well how capitalism works. Like, prisoners in prison right now know damn well how capitalism works. And in particular, they know how the big bosses and corporations will exploit you and take your money from you. Now, often this means that they will end up blaming it on, for example, reactionary sources. They might blame immigrants for their plights because they've been convinced that that's where the source of the problem is coming from, or they might blame, other gangs or people who are around them or whatever. But the point is that they do genuinely understand their own immiseration and their own experience of the system, and that it is certainly messed up. If you ask most people on the street, they will tell you, no, screw the big banks. No, screw, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. Like, they might say, okay, maybe they deserve some of their money because they produce something. But broadly, they wouldn't say that about their manager. They think their manager is incompetent. They think their boss is incompetent. They think the CEO of the company they're working at is incompetent, more than likely. And through all of that, right, there are still many, many people who believe that the system is natural and good. So that's kind of what we're trying to break down here, is that we're understanding the more we know about the bourgeoisie, the more we know about this class system, the more that we can take those tools against that class system. That's what historical materialism provides us. Every time we, Mikey, would you mind muting for a moment? It's all good. You're good. For every moment that we, again, learn about our own situation, we then create and furnish the tools of the end of the existence of the ruling class. Okay. I'll skip some of the proletariat stuff because I think we generally understand now why the proletariat is revolutionary. They know that everything is messed up and they want to do something about it. We talked a little bit about how to classify ourselves. So I'm going to skip that section because we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The final thing I wanted to address is sometimes Marx and Engels attempt to explain everything in society in terms of class. Are Marx and Engels class reductionists? What does this mean? Is there anything in society that's sometimes more important than class? I would offer this as a general discussion question, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to answer it more directly. Class society just means that there is social stratification tied to the material distribution of goods in that society. This means that your social position is necessarily determined by your material reality. That's it. It means that instead of in like a pre-class society where most people were not considered, hierarchically better or worse than anyone else among them, and that they worked together as equals, as genuine equals amongst one another, sharing goods and resources and tasks and services and gifts and debts and whatnot in order to make society function, because they were more focused on living to the next day as opposed to constructing, I don't know, the next freaking self-help book or whatever. The point is of these times that we can talk about as opposed to now is that class society as we see it is certainly stratified, and it certainly affects the material experiences of real people. And so while you may be right, that's all good, Sam. While you may be right that there are certainly things like, for example, race, gender, nationality, religion that affect the way someone experiences capitalism or class society, it is certainly true that they will experience class society, and that those other tools of bourgeois reality have been constructed to pit us as workers against one another. This is not to say that those issues don't matter or aren't a version of hyper-exploitation or something that we should have attention to as socialists. We are certainly interested in the multiracial international working class, which means that we care about the plight of those in Palestine. We care about our queer folks who are experiencing harms in the United States that are getting legislated out of existence, that we care about those who are in prisons right now for things that literally don't fucking matter, like drug possession. You know what I mean? Like, of course, we care about these things in their own context, and we work to end homelessness or end anti-queer violence or hate crimes and things like that, obviously. But we also have to understand that this is a class society. And until we move forward to where we have a more equal society where classes are now dissolved, we cannot resolve the fact that the bourgeoisie will continue to impose these internal divides amongst us. Like, for example, the legal constitution of race or the divisions of gender or nationality or religion. Okay. I think we broadly understand capitalist exploitation. I'm just going to address one more question, then we'll move on to section 2, which is, here we go. Yeah, we'll do this question. Are economic crises inevitable under capitalism? What would Marx and Engels say? Anyone can answer this. Mikey says yes. I'll take head nods or thumbs down or arguments or however you like. Sarah says, I don't know.
I mean, I guess because they do happen under capitalism. So yes.
They do happen a lot, yeah. Are they inevitable though?
Well, we kind of discussed it earlier, talking about how eventually it will lead to overproduction, under demand, and then they will expand to other countries, and then eventually shit will hit the fan. I don't know. Are we allowed to curse?
Yeah.
But it's just gonna hit the fan, and we're gonna run out of people or materials or something to exploit in some way. Now, right now, considering the tools that we have at our disposal, that's difficult to identify, like, when is that going to happen, considering we are able to go to whole other countries on other continents to exploit resources and people. But eventually we will not be able, like, the bourgeois class is not going to be able to revolutionize production and change our minds into believing that that's sustainable when we're overproducing and there's under demand. So eventually there's going to be an economic crisis.
Yeah,
That's great.
I was gonna talk like I took back like in Econ 110 or whatever that class is. You learn that like capitalism only functions as like a cyclical pattern between like recession and whatever the opposite of recession is, and like so capitalists will like they know that like yeah there's gonna be hard times in order for there to be not hard times under capitalism, but like yeah, so I think it is inevitable under capitalism is my point.
Yeah. So broadly, Marx and Engels would say, yes, it is inevitable under capitalism. And so is sort of immiseration, right? So I think we broadly covered the idea of like the boom and bust cycle. But I think we also have to talk about is like, it is still exploitation to work for a wage. And here's this paragraph that really elucidates that. While workers sometimes win their immediate demands for better wages or improved working conditions, these victories are only temporary so long as relations of class exploitation continue to exist. The most important achievement of these struggles is the increased organization and coordination of the working class as a whole, which is facilitated by dramatic improvements in communication and transportation. So essentially, that paragraph talks about how like, yeah, so what? You got better wages or more working conditions. You're still working for a wage. You are still dependent upon the capitalist system in order to survive. You're still dependent on your boss not firing you in order to buy your next meal. You're still dependent upon this system of speculative investment and taking and taking and taking from you until you are literally dead on the door front, because that is what you are worth to the system. You need to save for your own retirement, because guess what? You're not worth it to us until when you stop working. Like you've got to be kidding me. It's kind of those basic facts, or the downward pressure on wages is sort of inevitable with the rising prices of goods. We see this in our own day. We literally, as a class, I'll say, but as a group, as a generation, we literally can't even afford the goods that we are working for. Like every time we go to every time you work at Chipotle, let's say you make $15 an hour, you have to work a whole hour before you can even buy the Chipotle that you're making. How many Chipotle meals did you make in that hour? That's messed up. It's just on yeah.
This kind of topic, but one of the things that like radicalized me was working in my high school job, and me as a cashier, my cashier alone would bring in like $5,000 a day, and I got paid $10 an hour, and I was like, this is bullshit. Like, this is crazy.
Yeah.
We standing there with like a 5 or 6 shakes, and they're all like, and it's like $30 or $40, and I'm like, hold on a second, I'm only making $7.25.
Yes.
This is such a bullshit.
Yeah, I wish we could dive more into why capitalism is so miserating, but I think we all, at least in this room, kind of understand it. And if you want more deep dives on that, we can do that in future lectures. When I do the ABCs of socialism, I will definitely talk about more of these common arguments of why capitalism is natural. So, let's move on to section 2. Section 2, proletarians and communists. Before we move on, I want you to understand one key facet about the Communist Manifesto, and I'm going to share my screen once again. Let's pull this up, share sound.
It's important we briefly cover the context in which the Communist Manifesto was written. In 1847, when Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote the piece, socialism and communism were not clearly defined concepts. Everyone had their own eclectic ideas about what these terms meant, all trying to address the problems which had been produced by a fully blooming capitalist society, problems we're still dealing with today. The only thing that was commonly understood by these terms was something beyond the present state of things. And for people in high society at the time whose wealth and property owed its existence to the present state of things, socialism and communism were vague and threatening concepts. Especially communism, which had developed a strong association with the working class emerging at the time who owned nothing and had no strong ties to the current order. Now, what Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels set out to do in the Communist Manifesto was to properly define what that something beyond the present state of things meant. And they do something very interesting.
So, I'm going to stop right there. Yes, they are trying to determine and demonstrate to the working peoples in France what exactly communism means and what it does. So this section 2, as you may have kind of understood, is a definition of what is a communist? What are we as communists at the time doing? And what do we believe? Why do we believe it? And what makes us distinct? Right? This is trying to educate people that we are different from those other socialists over there. We are communists, and this is why, this is what we say about communism and why it is a good idea. So we're going to kind of go through some big subjects that are in this section about the principles of communism and what communism hopes to bring us that we should be excited for. First, communists have no interests beyond the interests of the proletariat. That is said in the Communist Manifesto. Now, why are they separate then? What is the difference between the communists and the proletariat? Does anyone have any idea?
The only thing that I can think of that I remember from the reading was they mentioned that the proletariat may be more focused on themselves, whereas communists are entirely beholden to the idea of all people everywhere, like bringing up all proletariats, like not just one community, but everybody equally.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Essentially, when they say they have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as the whole, they do not set up any special principles of their own by which to shape and mold the proletarian movement. The initial assumption would be like, okay, well, if the proletariat knows what they need, then what do you need with the communists, right? The whole point is that you're right. The communists are beholden to the rights of all to seek that liberation, right? And to end the hegemony of the oppressing class. Therefore, communists do not set up independent wants and needs. For example, I want this really fancy pink house, and that's why I'm a communist. Like, getting gay space communism is not the goal of communism, right? The goal of communism is that everyone is on an equal playing field and is also necessarily, not necessarily getting like equal outcomes in that sense, but rather determining and actually achieving actual equality, where no one in society is experiencing class society or that stratification that we've talked about causes so much immiseration. So Marx and Engels elucidate on this when they say the theoretical conclusions of communists are in no way based on ideas or principles they have invented or discovered. By this, that would be a universal reformer. They merely express, in general terms, actual relations springing from existing class struggle, from historical movement along and going under our variants. Now let's see, I think I have the text here. I mean, I have a text up there. So when we talk about analyzing the communists versus the working people, we can look at texts like this, which you may have never seen this before. This is called The Strategy for the Liberation of Palestine. You can read this at any time. It's from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a left socialist movement back in the 70s or 80s in Palestinian history. I could be a little bit wrong in the decades. I did just finish reading that essay about Palestinian left movements. But essentially, they go through this book and they're like, hey, we are the communists. we would like to set up this party to defend socialism in Palestine. And so what they do is they write in this book, they write all about how here are like 10 different ways that society has like different people stratified. And here's our responses to the way that they are stratified. But in every single one of them, they always come back to this point of like, we want liberation for not just the nation of Palestinians, but rather for the liberation of all peoples. And that there's a reason they pick socialism as their guiding doctrine, because they don't think that just getting a Palestinian state is enough. They think that they need to end class society in order for these imperial wars to end as well. So that's a good example of like why communists might have no interest separate from the proletariat, is because they genuinely are a representation of the proletariat's interests. This is also where Lenin gets his idea of the vanguard party, where he says that the communists have no interest beyond the proletariat. Therefore, the vanguard party is simply an expression of the proletariat, not above, not distinct from the proletariat, but rather members of the proletariat who are prepared to respond to the class situation that they are in and begin or develop the revolution. Okay. We're going to skip the bourgeois property stuff because I'll get that on the ABCs of capitalism.
I was literally going to say something about the vanguard party, and so you stole what I was going to say. Because everything you were saying sounded very similar to that, but I wasn't quite sure.
Yeah, it quite does. Yeah. We're going to talk a little bit here about wage labor in particular, because I know we talked a bit about the end of the last section. But in particular, these two paragraphs stood out to me. In bourgeois society, living labor is but a means to increase accumulated labor. That means the labor that we do is a means to increase the wealth of the wealthy. In communist society, accumulated labor is but a means to widen, to enrich, to promote the existence of the laborer. That provides pretty good evidence of like the kinds of thing that communists want. They don't want a society where everything goes to this like top echelon of government class, right? That is not what they want. They want the actual social control of all the means of shit that's in the economy to be owned and benefited from by the people. The second paragraph also elucidates that. In bourgeois society, therefore, the past dominates the present. In communist society, the present dominates the past. In bourgeois society, capital is independent and has individuality, while the living person is dependent and has no individuality. So for example, Jeff Bezos can do whatever the hell he wants, but your average person walking the streets does not have the ability to even like get sick, because that could cost them their life, and not just like actually, but also financially. Those are the kinds of things like the bourgeois notion of freedom, right? We do not have freedom. We have to wait for our next paycheck to determine what freedom looks like for us for the next 2 weeks or 1 week or whenever you get paid. So it's those kinds of notions that demonstrate why wage labor is a version of the kinds of immiseration that class society brings upon us. Okay, let's now talk about the principles of revolution, because just as much as we can talk about the immiseration of the working class, what do we actually do about it? And just as much as we talk about what communists want, how do we get there? Marx and Engels in the next paragraph, so the one right after what I just read, says, and the abolition of this state of things is called by the bourgeois abolition of individuality and freedom. And rightly so, the abolition of bourgeois individuality, bourgeois independence, and bourgeois freedom is undoubtedly aimed at by, I think it says the communists, but what do we think about this statement? Is there anything that this brings up for us? In particular, what does it mean to abolish this state of things? What does that bring up in you?
I just want to acknowledge how much this statement kicks ass. Because plenty of times people will be like, anti-communists will be like, what, you want to get rid of all property? People would be like, oh, they're like tiptoe over it, and try to like explain it in more detail. But Marx is just, yes, we do want to get rid of our property. We are getting rid of it. We are getting rid of bourgeois independent, etc. Yeah, facing the criticism head on instead of like trying to sidestep it.
Yeah, that's true. As socialists, like that's why the YDSA and whenever I'm tabling, I say the words, we are unapologetically socialist, right? That we genuinely dedicate ourselves to this science and thought because we do believe that it can bring about the best of things in not only ourselves, but in our fellow worker. Anyone else got a thought about the abolition of this state of things? just like what does it bring up in you? Are there any things that it seems related to, thoughts that you have about that?
I think it's interesting that in this, when they're talking about abolishing the state of things, abolishing individuality, abolishing freedom, they directly equate that to the bourgeoisie, but doesn't mention the proletariat at all. And so it's also equating the state of things is the bourgeoisie. And so that's the only thing that matters in this current system. So the proletariat doesn't matter at all. So when we're trying to change what's going on right now, what we need to do is we need to change or get rid of the bourgeoisie.
Excellent. Excellent identification there, because that's exactly what Marx and Engels are doing with dialectics and historical materialism, is they are saying this society is bourgeois society. And until we recognize that, we cannot, then participate in bourgeois society, reform bourgeois society, because it's still bourgeois. Like, it's not going to, just because we become happier within capitalism and have ice cream machines in every corner does not mean that we are still not dependent upon that system for our very livelihood and existence. Like, that's a problem. So, yeah. Those are all good things, and we'll talk about a little bit more about that, but here are some like specific principles of the revolution. The first I want to talk about is the family, because this is often related to gendered liberation, queer liberation, sexuality liberation. Like, all of these things are generally caught up within the ideas of the family. There's lots of works you can read these days about how the nuclear family kind of structures our, homophobia and transphobia and the way that we respond to those who are seen as like deviant from the family model. But according to Marx and Engels, capitalism destroys the family. Do you agree with this? Should we support the traditional family? I don't imagine this question's all like that particular question you have to answer. But like, what exactly do they mean, or do you think they mean by the family should be abolished altogether?
I think it's probably in reference to like how children used to be exploited for labor and how men see their wives as something that they can exploit. And so communism would bring the end to that.
Love that. Love that. Any other examples of what abolishing the family might be like? Or even how does capitalism destroy the family?
I love the bit where he's like, "You accuse us of holding wives in common, but you guys are doing that. Like, you guys commit adultery all the fucking time. Not only the bourgeoisie like have their way with like every proletarian woman, but they also obsessed with each other's wives." And anyways, how can we destroy something which you have already destroyed? I thought that was hilarious.
Yes. Yes.
But, that's one of I think we probably can all name examples of ways in which the family is abolishing itself by how like the ideal of the family as like a loving, caring relationship that like supports each other is like abolished daily by the actual material reality of how money and property interact with family relationships. And how so I think that's what Marx is trying to get at, that the family has already been abolished by capitalism, and so if communists would kind of be creating the family as it ideally should be a loving relationship, though also would be like socializing a lot of the labor that comes with child rearing and that kind of thing, which would help the family, because like I'm sure we all have like siblings, and we all watched our moms be like overworked because raising kids and that kind of thing. We all know about this, and this is the thing that Marx is trying to get at, I think.
Gabe?
Yeah, I think one of the either the number one or one at the top of the list for reasons for divorce is financial issues. And going back to the idea of like the white picket fence and the house having the wife and husband and 2 kids and the dog, and it turns into having a family almost into a comparative, like almost competition between each other, like who has the better family and things like that. And a lot of people get married kind of like, oh, it's financially beneficial for us to get married and for taxes and all this kind of stuff, rather than like just having a family because you love each other and you want to have kids for the sake of doing it, rather than all the capitalism elements that are tied into it.
Yeah, what would happen if we, abolished the need to like combine finances in order to fucking survive, right? Or like to child rearing was possible by a single parent without the need of support by like another person. What would society look like? And it'd be probably drastically different. Toby, did you have something?
There's also the idea that when you force the idea of family, like there are so many people who, like, okay, you graduate from high school, you either get a job or you go to college, you get married, and then you have kids. And the expectation is that everybody's going to have kids. And there's this idea of like birth rate crisis. And it's like, who actually, like, declining birth rates, who is that actually a crisis for? Because, like, for the proletariat, oh, did you have kids? No? Okay. But who actually cares about whether you have kids or not? It's the people who need more workers in their economy to perform their labor. And so the idea of forcing this idea of a family and the necessity of having children simply to feed your economy. Like when like we talk about freedom, when you remove this expectation that everybody's going to have a family and have kids, you give them more more freedom in that way.
Yeah, exactly. So I wanted to read this paragraph from the manifesto that says, "On what foundation is the present family, the bourgeois family, based? On capital, on private gain. In its completely developed form, this family exists only among the bourgeoisie. But this state of things finds its complement in the practical absence of the family among the proletarians and in public prostitution." Now, public prostitution likely does not mean in this context actually like selling your body for sex work in particular. What Marx and Engels are talking more about is the way that you sell your body for labor, right? That you sell your labor power to the capitalist in part. The other thing is that when we're talking about the absence of the family among the proletarians, like how many people in this room have like experienced divorce, separation, non-traditional families, different parental structures, grandparent structures? Like I'm sure we've all, or at least met other people who are like that. There are so many members of the proletariat, in part because there's just so many of us, right? That have experienced these different family structures because, like, let's be real. There was never actually an ideal of like the one income that would support the working family and allow us to have the 2 dogs and the kids in the house and all that thing. That was reserved for the richy rich assholes who owned everything. Like that's who got it. And then even then, they still cheated on their wives. They still, succumb to the whims of like, competition and these other things of like, wealth and status and trying to maintain themselves as like dominant men and problematic visions of masculinity and wealth and competition. Like all of that crap destroyed the family first. So it's funny how Marx says, Marx and Engels write, quote, "Abolition of the family, even the most radical flare-up at this infamous proposal of the communists." Like they literally, they call it out how silly it is. The capitalists call them out for this stuff. Okay. I could talk a lot more about like queer and gendered liberation from that context, but we'll talk more about that when we get to the origin of the family and property and stuff. Essentially, the fact that the family is in this like structured bourgeois unit means that we can compare other families based on that. And so when you are queer, when you are gay, when you are trans, when you are a woman, those things now count against you and mean that you have different societal expectations based on that. I don't know that we have to go too far into that. Marx and Engels don't go too far into that in this document because they were convincing mostly working class men to join the party, which meant that they did not focus near as much on like women's liberation. But it is quite interesting. They spent a lot of time talking about how women are particularly harmed by the system of exploitation. So like for the people, like the audience that they were talking to, it is quite surprising how much they actually talked about women's liberation within the text, if you remember from the reading. Okay. Is communism compatible with human nature? We'll talk about that with the ABCs of socialism. Let's do these last 2 points. So first is revolution and the 10-point program. Revolution, though. Think back again to the preface. Are we to cast aside the cries and suffering of the working class for the temporary feelings of its subjugation under revolution? Should we dismiss the fervor of need for change? Should we abandon the need of the proletariat, not to escape, but to transform the conditions of society that produce our lived existence? Now, that's a bunch of rhetorical questions. I'm obviously implying that we should not abandon the needs of the working class, that revolution means something. Now, the real question is, how does that revolution come about? There are, in Marx and Engels' time, right, there's no such thing, at least in their time, when they're writing this document, of a like standard political party for communists as we know today. Most of what they knew was pretty much direct armed revolt. Now, there are lots of disputes and understandings today about what socialism or a socialist revolution would look like. As a national organization, the YDSA takes a broad position that essentially says, oh, the first English translator of the manifesto was a woman. Yes, yes. The broad prescription for transition when it comes to the YDSA in particular is that we are democratic socialists. So there is both an electoral component as well as a sort of like societal transformation component to our organizing. This means that, as the organization would say, is that revolution constitutes the formation of an potentially independent political party where we run candidates and utilize the tools of politics and society as they exist to transform that society with massively, they call it anti-reformist reform or anti-state laws. However contradictory you may see that, it is a strategy that some use to proffer a more socialist society. Other successful revolutions have been through direct armed revolt or confrontation. I am not advocating any of you do anything illegal right now. I'm just saying that that is history, that like the existence of the Cuban state is based on armed revolution. The existence of the USSR was dependent upon the October Revolution, and the existence of China was dependent upon the armed revolution of the Maoist regime. So those are the like different interpretations of what revolution means, and we could talk about many of them, but we just don't have time to go into all of them. So what I do want to talk about, though, in particular, is what exactly is the purpose of the working class then? How does it gain political supremacy, and what does the proletariat do with the power once they are in power? So the way you should probably think about answering this question or approach it is think about what are steps you might think about taking as a member of the working class that you think would be useful for the socialist project, and then what does the proletariat, i.e. you, do with the power you have now?
Could you repeat that question?
Yeah. So the question officially was, how does the proletariat gain political supremacy, and what does the proletariat do with that power? So the way to think about this is, what are some methods to gain that political power? And then what do you do with that power?
First basic step I would say is raise class consciousness, make the other people aware of their conditions. I don't know. That question is something that I think about all the time that I just don't know the answer to.
Yeah, yeah. Anyone else got thoughts?
Look, we just got to commit some crimes, which I will not name here, but I think we have to do some illegal actions. Not we in this room, but we generally as the proletariat.
Society will do it on our behalf. Fair enough.
Mikey's very aware that this is being recorded and going to be posted somewhere.
Oh, yeah.
Mikey is totally aware that that is all jokes. So, yeah, it's all comedic relief. This whole thing is just cut
this out. You can cut this part out if we need.
We're good, Mikey. You're literally fine. So yeah, those are some things. I think that the biggest sort of answers that Marx and Engels try to provide for this question is, for political supremacy, it means that the proletariat seizes the means of production. You've probably heard this phrase before. It just means that the proletariat needs to own and actually have total control over the ability to reproduce society. This means that they would own the factories. They would own or have control over the ability to, do things like have a military, or even do things like, I don't know, make ideas hegemonic, right? Make money. If that's how they want to set up society, they can have money. Often communism is defined as like classless, moneyless society, but at least a socialist transition would likely include some kind of, moneyed economy. So given some of those things, what does the proletariat do with that power? Marx and Engels are pretty clear, and we'll get to this quote at the very end of the book. They're pretty clear that the proletariat absolutely knows what to do with that power, and that the program is outlined below. Here's a 10-point program. 1. The abolition of property in land and application of all rents to public purposes. 2. A heavy progressive graduated income tax. 3. The abolition of all right of inheritance. 4. Confiscation of property of all emigrant and rebels. And 5. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of national bank with state capital and exclusive monopoly. 6. Centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. 7. Extensions of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, the bringing into cultivation of wastelands, and the improvement of soil generally in accordance with the common plan. 8. Equal liability of all to labor, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. 9. The combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the population over the country. And 10. Free education for all the children in public schools, abolition of children's factory labor in its present form, combination of education with industrial production. That's their 10-point plan. Like that, I didn't hear a single thing in there that, other than some like debates about like property being necessary or good or something like that. I didn't hear anything in there that would be like necessarily bad for society. Does anyone have anything that you might like be a bit confused about in that 10-point plan, or would want to address as like you don't agree with that point?
I had something that I was going to ask about, but then I want like the third point or something. I can't remember. Can you read the
third point? Third point was the abolition of all right of inheritance.
No, not that one. Anyways,
confiscation of property of all emigrants and rebels.
Oh, that one. Yeah, I was like, could we expound upon that? Because meaning EM.
Yes, so those who leave. So what that means is that like a capitalist could not be like, oh, I own this factory and all the machines in it. I'm going to take all the machines, put them on a boat, and send them over to some other country as I flee this socialist state. That's the goal. You would have to leave the machines, you'd have to leave all your stuff, because if you don't have inheritance or you don't have like wealth necessarily, then like what would you be taking with you when you're emigrating? And the same with rebels, like the consequence of that would be like, okay, if people are like trying to tear down the state, they don't get to have property in any form, which is already the condition of bourgeois society. They just call that prison. So,
and I think there's also an important distinction between personal and private property, and that I think a lot of people, especially on the right, when they're trying to get into an argument or debate, saying like, oh, the communists, they're going to take everything that you own. And it's like, from my understanding, there's no communist that's saying that if they were to take over, they're going to take your Xbox away, or like your book collection or anything like that. Like you're still going to have like personal property, things of that nature. It's like talking about private property, like land and the means of production, that sort of thing. And so that's why I think also with the inheritance, again, it's like if I have like I'm really into antiques. Like if I have an antique that I want to pass on to future generations, I don't think there's necessarily a problem with that. It's more of like owning vast tracts of land and then that being inherited. So
yeah, they're not planning on taking your like, knickknacks that you've collected over time. Like that's not their goal, is to like take your, I don't know, bird golf club theme collection. Like I don't know what that is. I don't know what that would be, but I'm sure someone has that collection somewhere, and they're not taking that. They don't need that. What they're saying is that essentially for particularly property, which we didn't get to in section 1, but I wanted to talk about it about right now, which is the notion of private property is the ability of the bourgeois class to have social power from the property they own. Proletarians do not get social power from the property we own. For example, owning a house does not guarantee us purchase within the legislature, within politics, within society writ large. Just by owning a house, you may have some more power necessarily, or like stratification compared to other folks that are around you, but that doesn't guarantee you those rights indefinitely, and it definitely does not guarantee you placement within the bourgeois class. This is why so many Americans tend to identify themselves with being middle class, in part because they just don't want to call themselves poor. Like, let's be real. Most people in America are poor. That is just like statistics. You can read that. Millions of people are poor, but most of them identify with lower middle class or upper middle class. Not only identifying with the idea of bourgeois society, of like moving up in the world, but also with thinking themselves in the position of being participatory within bourgeois society in a way that's positive for them. And then avoiding the association with being a member of the proletariat. So this is the way that they can act against their own interests, and also not understand, without that class consciousness, that they are certainly a part of the class that is being oppressed and should change their situation. Okay, so when it comes to private versus personal, oh yeah, Mikey. Here.
I also would like, sorry, I interrupted you, but I was just thinking that, what does he mean by the abolition of town and country? Does he mean that, like, everyone is this like literal, as in we will all be evenly distributed on square density across the whole face of the earth? Or that, like, the social conditions will be the same for all people everywhere?
It's more the latter, but not necessarily not the former. So what Marx and Engels are talking about when they talk about the abolition of town and country kind of relates to this idea of like private versus personal property. The whole reason that like cities condense in the way they do is because of the necessity of like capitalists owning all of these buildings in this one particular area. So then, they build housing on top of that in order to make sure all the workers are located next to their jobs. But it specifically prevents the ag workers, for example, from interacting with the city workers and having that sort of like cross-cultural interaction. And that's what produces a lot of things of like the reactionary right is largely lesser educated, poorer workers in the southern parts of our country, because those are the most isolated parts of the country. Toby, did you have thoughts?
I had a question.
Yeah.
If you're done discussing that point about number 8.
Mikey, did that answer your question?
Yeah, that made sense.
Yeah. Okay, Toby.
So point 8, equal liability of all to labor. The way I'm reading that is that everybody is expected to contribute to the society.
Yes.
I don't think, okay. When we talk about equal liability, I immediately get concerned about folks with disabilities and what happens to people who cannot equally contribute to the, like, this new economy. Like, obviously it's not the same as capitalism, but in a sense of everyone has to contribute. What happens to people who don't meet whatever your definition of contribution is?
Yes, so there's a great example for this. The like classic is, I think it was like Jonestown or whatever. There's that story about like, oh, if you don't work, you don't eat. That is not how most socialist economies or societies have ever worked. Instead, it is very much according to the Marxian principle that he develops in the writing called The Critique of the Gotha Program, which is from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. So Marx very much recognizes that there are proletarians who do, for reasons of war, of birth, of existence, of whatever, society even, experience some different levels of ability, and each of them has something to contribute to society. They all do. And if they don't, and I'm putting that in big air quotes because that's like a huge assumption people make like about disabled people, is like, oh, well, that person doesn't contribute to society because they're like on a ventilator or something like that. Like, no, that's not necessarily true. And so Marx does problematize that idea and just says that the principle itself is that you have a liability to contribute to society and that you should be a part of society. But the other thing is that we each have a liability to one another in that labor. There's a lot of theorists now who like theorize the way that like love, companionship, community can be developed in a way that respects each other's abilities while also making sure that we attend to each other's needs in a radical socialist way. There's lots more readings that we can do on that in the future, but I would not say that Marx is necessarily like being ableist, by saying equality, equal liability of all to labor, because when he says equal liability, he just means that we are all a part of that society and we should all contribute, but he's not saying equal liability of all to labor the exact same amount, if that makes sense.
And I would also say that in the 10 points, there's an exemption to the people who should labor, that is children. So clearly there's people in society who are contributing, like I would say that children are contributing to society by like being educated. That's probably how he thinks about it. But there are people who are in society who are not working, who are part of the socialist society.
Yeah, and socialist societies were some of the first to develop the biggest programs for like parental leave, in particular for, like when someone gives birth, they recognize that like, okay, whoa, you probably don't need to be in the factory floor. You can like stay home and like take care of a child. And, domestic work matters too, or like existence matters too. And you have to put those things first. Longer vacation times were all the grassroots efforts by socialists in America and Europe to create the conditions for us to access things, like leisure and things like that wouldn't be available in a capitalist society. One other thing is like you could always read the Black Panther 10-point program is a really good example of how like this 10-point program is utilized by multiple socialist movements in the future to then like understand their own projections of the future and how to attain that. So I don't know if like in particular to disability, but I know there were like certain provisions about like the safety of Black people from police violence that was like, we analyzed the situation of our time as the Panthers did. And they say, okay, we're looking at the world that we are in. It really sucks for us because of police brutality. Here's what we can do about it. Right? And they developed that 10-point program based on it. Marx is saying here in a time of like pretty much brute labor in factories and sweatshops, that was like primarily what capitalism looked like for him, that the ability of all to labor is like primarily the people he's speaking to are the people who are laboring in those factories. So there is some critique to be like, okay, he's talking to an audience and the way he's talking to them like might leave out some other folks. And that's probably true. But I think broadly the principle can be easily applied now in ways that are respecting of the contemporary situation we're in.
I kind of tie in my mind to like worker cooperatives and like employee-owned companies, especially on the smaller scale. Like I visited a bookstore that was like an anarchist bookstore in Seattle. And so it's like all the people that work in the bookstore, they all take a turn at the cash register. They all have equal share in the decision-making and the profits and everything. And so they didn't have any managers that just sat on their ass and told other people what to do. They all participated equally in the building of the the bookstore and everything.
I've seen other models. There's like an apparel store that I've followed on TikTok before that's like they have a split ownership system where like your seniority gives you more say in what happens with the company and what's going on. And while this is not necessarily a communistic system of operation, this might be a socialistic way of doing it, where everyone is also paid the exact same, and then bonuses are collectively decided upon who gets those rewards. So in similar, like a society that is properly communistic would definitely not sacrifice disabled people because it would understand that like the needs of disabled people are equal to the needs of all the working people. And I put that in quotes again because like disabled people can do labor that's maybe invisible or unrecognized. But in those systems, they would like redefine what equality means in those contexts. So I hope that was a decent explanation to answer that question. We do have to move on to the next section, the last section we're going to talk about, because we've only got a few extra minutes left. So let's get to it.
I have to head out. I have to head out. So
great.
I'll see you guys, I guess, tomorrow.
Yep. See you tomorrow. Okay. So notwithstanding any other questions about those kind of 10-point programs, I think we understand that bare minimum, communism wants like equality for all. Not equality in the sense that we are all absolutely automatons, that we are equal to one another in that way, but rather that we actually get to experience the fruits of our own labor, of others' labor, of society as a whole, and that we get to fully live our lives to the potential that it could be, were we not immiserated under capitalism or immiserated under class society. So we get to this final section, and this is where Marx is talking about socialist and communist literature. In particular, he's talking about the different kinds of socialist and communist literature that are being distributed as he's writing the manifesto. So given some of that historical context, he talks about various types of socialism. He talks about feudal socialism. He also talks about utopian socialism. I am going to focus for time's sake on feudal socialism and maybe a little bit of utopian socialism, but we're going to go through this a bit quick, so we might not have to have as much discussion. First is feudal socialism. So why does Marx particularly call out the return to feudalism? Well, here's the context for this section. In the early 19th century, as Phil Gasper writes, socialism was used very broadly to refer to any concern with the social problems produced by capitalism. Reactionary socialists wanted to solve these problems by returning to an earlier form of society, i.e. feudalism. Essentially, these are people who are not members of the bourgeoisie necessarily, but may have been members of the ruling class, like, for example, former lords or members of the papacy or the church, who were particularly miffed, if you will, by the existence of capitalism because it meant that they no longer were, for example, ordained by God to have their position in society, and that was getting disrupted. Others might have said similarly, like reactionary proletarians may have said that feudalism was better because I don't have to think about where I need to labor tomorrow. Instead, I always just labor on my farm. Like, that is definitely one way to think about returning to feudalism. The kind of like idealism of the past and not being able to recognize the progress of the future is something that we see today in like fascist ideation of the Roman Empire, or, you know, which was literally built on slave society, or even our own society, and like in the past, and like, oh, well, the Civil War was about states' rights and how awesome the democratic process of America was, ignoring like slavery and genocide, colonization, all these things, right? That things like fascism, which idealize the past and try to reify them in the present in order to save capitalism from itself, are examples of how the identification of the problems of capitalism can mean that you end up retrenching capitalism. One other example would be like a business owner saying, no, I don't like monopoly capitalism, but you know that real free market capitalism, that's the good shit. Like, that's the kind of stuff that we're trying to avoid with authorization, because it literally just reproduces like, we're still working for a wage, we're still dependent on the capitalist for our livelihoods. That's a problem. We've discussed many of those issues above, but as communists, we're broadly opposed to those things. So feudal socialism then is not a socialism in the way we think about it, but rather feudal opposition to capitalism, which means return to feudalism. Obviously, we don't want to return to feudalism. Please, let's not return to feudalism. The key part of this particular trend in that research at the time was the playing proletarian, as I will call it. So how exactly can we as socialists guard against the harms of aligning with the wrong groups? Well, here's what Marx and Engels say about it. In political practice, therefore, they, as in the feudal socialists, join in all coercive measures against the working class, and in ordinary life, despite their highfalutin phrases, they stoop to pick up the golden apples dropped from the tree of industry and to barter fidelity, love, and honor for the traffic in wool, beetroot sugar, and potato spirits. So what Marx and Engels are saying is like, you can see it. Like, when you analyze their situations, you can literally see when they benefit from capitalist society while saying essentially, boo-hoo, woe is me, I would like the old class society back again. Okay, that brings us to utopian socialism. This is where I spend a little bit more time, because I think that most people are not advocating for feudalism, and those who are advocating for like former capitalism are genuinely mostly misled, and most people are not in that camp these days. It's usually just like political pundits and stuff. Most people are in this category of like utopian socialism, or what might also be called liberalism today. Some may hate the fact that I just said that, They are not equal. I'm just saying that liberalism tends to follow the ideological trends of utopian socialism and the mistakes of that idea, of that working practice. So here's what Marx and Engels say about that practice. The work of the German literati, as in the like philosophers, the writers of that time, consisted solely in bringing new French ideas into harmony with their ancient philosophical conscience, or rather in annexing the French ideas without deserting their own philosophic point of view. The German true socialists attempted to merge Kantian and socialist ideas, thereby depriving socialism of its class perspective. This is key. He's saying that the intelligentsia of the time, the academics, the bigwigs, literally bigger wigs, who were writing at the time, were utilizing the ire of being philosophically correct to idealize their way to the best socialism. Robert Owens is a good example of this. He is a man who wrote at the time about creating the socialist utopia that he wanted, and then went to the United States to found his own little town, and in 3 years it failed because his utopian idealism didn't pan out with material reality. He just hoped that, for example, if you just make your right socialism within capitalist society, then capitalism will look at that and go, oh my God, that looks so cool. Why don't we just all do that? And the bourgeoisie can lay down their arms and give up the means of production, and we can all be happy together. Like, clearly these things are not going to happen because of the conflicting interests between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Marx and Engels have these final words to have on this subject. The introduction of these philosophical phrases at the back of French historic criticisms they dubbed philosophy of action, true socialism, German scientific socialism, philosophical foundation of socialism, and so on. You notice this, and it's actually in, I think, Lenin's State and Revolution, it's really clear, where the bourgeoisie will take moments and ideas from socialism and try to repurpose them and explain that this was a bourgeois idea all along, and that you should actually endorse bourgeois ideas because that's how you're going to survive. This is related to, but not the same as, the idea where bourgeois society will take socialist ideas and turn it into their own, or just like adopt them entirely as a concession to the working class. In utopian socialism, this is, we have thought up the right way to do communism, and therefore we're going to live that, and then people will just understand that that is the right way to live and then join us in a sort of cultish sense. Scientific socialism is distinct. That's what Marx and Engels were arguing for. When they say, here's what history looks like, here's how it transitions, here's how it goes into the future, here is what our current situation looks like, here's what we can do, here's how it'll look in the future. Those things are testable, predictable hypotheses in a scientific method, if you will, for how to respond to society. And those go beyond the idealism of, well, I'd like someone to hang grapes over my face so I can eat them from their hand. Like, that is BS, and no one is going to attain that level of socialism anytime soon. So in lieu of that, we have to develop the literal science of how to do things like revolution, develop communist parties, and responses to our material situations. Okay, I know I've monologued for a bit of that section. Are there any questions about the different parties or like conflicting interests that were there at the time that Marx was responding to, or any thoughts that you wanted to add quickly before I move to the conclusion? Any lingering questions or confusions at all? It's okay, I'm good to leave a long pause. Well, seeing none, I appreciate all of you being here for this. I have like a little monologue for the conclusion. Don't worry, I have plenty of those. But before we get there, I just wanted to say that for this document, please look through it. There's a lot of stuff that I didn't necessarily cover, and it's a good way to kind of like test yourself, read over those questions, see if you can answer them. And if you have more questions for me, reach out on the Discord. I love talking about this stuff and would love to be also proven wrong. So like if you have a thing that you're like, I think that you were wrong about this, please let me know. We have open debates all the time, and I would love to be a better researcher and a better educator. So the other thing is I will send out a after meeting survey. So please fill that out. And it's not going to be like immediately after. I'll send it probably tomorrow before our meeting. Please fill it out and let me know how the session went so that I can, do better in the future. In conclusion, here are the final thoughts of the Communist Manifesto. In particular, a call to action. The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. In fact, there was a Supreme Court case in which they determined that the group was, in fact, necessarily violent revolutionaries against the government because they said they were communists. They read the Communist Manifesto, this paragraph in court, and the court was like, yeah, that sounds like armed insurgency to me. So that was during the McCarthy era and whatnot. And then later the Supreme Court ruled that you can't punish people for saying that. So the last thing I wanted to address is Phil Gasper, I think, has a good explanation at the end of the book about why reading this was like a good endeavor. So I wanted to give his thoughts here. So some Phil Gasper to close this out. It is, however, surely not the ruthless negativity of the manifesto that has made it the second best-selling book of all time, or that continues to ensure it a wide audience today. It is precisely because Marx and Engels argue that society can be radically changed that the manifesto has inspired its readers down the decades. But how seriously should their argument be taken today? The general principles laid down in the manifesto are, on the whole, as correct today as ever, even though the practical application of the principles will depend, as the manifesto itself states, everywhere and at all times, on the historical conditions for the time being existing. It is, to be sure, easy enough to comb through the manifesto to find the occasional rhetorical exaggeration, mistake, or failed prediction. But its general principles, and above all, its call for revolutionary change, are, if anything, even more relevant to the world today than they were in the middle of the 19th century.